were competitions under a different program called the Federal Arts Program. You know, this is entirely different than the WPA art program. You had to win. You were like a competitor.
We are such a rural community, we're a farming community, and to know that the New Deal was sort of about keeping hope and keeping, that we're all going to get back on the right track again after some tough times.
Because I was also teaching the New Deal, was what sort of institutions or projects did the feds sponsor that reached way out here to Wyoming.
It sounded interesting because I'd always seen that mural up in the Riverton post office. My mother has worked there for 25 years, so I would go in there a lot and didn't really know anything about it until I got a phone call about the mural in the post office, and that's when I started researching.
Many types of artwork surround us throughout our lives. Some is familiar, and some we forget about because of its familiarity. This story began when I heard that painters Thomas Hart Benton and Jackson Pollock, who was born in Cody, worked together in Wyoming as part of the New Deal Arts and Culture program. While that story turned out to be mostly urban legend, but somewhat true, my path led me to a public art model that is largely in place 85 years later. I tracked down 5 New Deal era artists who left their public art as their legacies in Wyoming during the Great Depression. The works depict regional conditions during the 1930s. It took an economic collapse to carve out this public art niche.
They used to tell me I was building a dream, and so I followed the mob. When there was earth to plow or guns to bear, I was always there, right on the job. They used to tell me I was building a dream, with peace and glory ahead. Why should I be standing in line, just waiting for bread?
The New Deal was a set of federal programs launched by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt after he took office during the Great Depression. The programs lasted until American entry into the Second World War.
Brother, can you spare a dime? Once I built a tower to the sun, brick, mortar, and lime. Once I built a tower, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime?
250,000 people are in Washington for the inauguration. But for those unable to get there, the Universal Newspaper newsreel is rushing pictures of the epic ceremony by the fastest air express plane in the country.
First of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis. Fraud, executive power, to wage a war against the emergency.
New Deal programs touched every state, including Wyoming. New Deal programs improved the lives of ordinary people when failed manufacturing and agricultural businesses were stabilized following the 1929 stock market crash. By 1933, 25% of all Americans were out of work. The New Deal hired 2.5 million men and women who built highways, bridges, schools, theaters, homes, post offices, and parks across the country. The New Deal brought civilian Conservation Corps workers from around the country to Wyoming, where they worked in places like Park County constructing the Heart Mountain War Relocation Camp, and to Platte County building campgrounds at Guernsey State Park. The New Deal Work Progress Administration and the U.S. Department of the Treasury hired artists to create public art and art projects.
I was teaching a course in American Studies that dealt with American art, and I stumbled on to the fact that the federal government in the 1930s had supported art and artists to some extent. I didn't know what.
The sensitive fingers of artists are poorly suited to manual labor, and in finding suitable work for musicians and other artists, the WPA has contributed greatly to the culture of America. A typical project is this Negro choir, singing the spirituals that are the real folk music of America. Painters, too, contribute their bit to making the Works program a real and permanent accomplishment. These reproductions of the American scene of today will make this one of the most fertile periods of our country's art. Some of this work is done on canvas, but much of it is created on the walls of our schools, libraries, and other public buildings in the form of mural paintings. Of particular interest is the great mural in the mess hall of the Military Academy at West Point, depicting great warriors of history. An art long dormant in the United States is the creation of stained glass windows. One project devoted to this art has made a window for the Military Academy at West Point, depicting scenes from the life of Washington. Commemorative tablets like this are among the contributions of sculptors to the Works program, and they also create works of art for our parks and public buildings.
5 such public mural projects adorn U.S. post offices in Kemmerer, Riverton, Powell, Greybull, and Worland. Eugene Kingman painted a triptych about the prehistory of the Kemmerer area.
My dad was a New Deal artist, among many other things. He did 3 post office murals under the program. He was a prodigy. He painted from the age of 5 and he was promoted by his parents to paint. He was a mural painter, so I'm pretty sure that through his connections at RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, that's how they were probably gave notices that it was a contest people could bid, because I know he bid on those while he was at RISD. So I'm sure that's where the connection made and how he was chosen. All the post office murals, be they a WPA program or a U.S. Treasury program for post office murals, that they all had to reflect the community in which they were being painted or produced. I know for Kemmerer that he had his students from RISD out there helping him install, and he was finishing up and he gave seminars about the mural, which I think passed on a lot of good information. I know he was just very interested in science and art. He was one of these people who really was ahead of his time in terms of interdisciplinary thinking, that science and art are together. And I know when the National Park Service hired him along with his geologist brother-in-law, they were a little skeptical about an artist, because his brother-in-law, they were hired to do some of the mapping of the national parks. And then he was hired to paint paintings, and maps. He was a cartographer during the war, so he knew cartography. And yet beyond that, he was a great landscape painter. So they were a little skeptical, according to my aunt. We're a little skeptical when they say, well, wait a minute, we're hiring this artist to do some technical things? Well, they were absolutely delighted by the results because they knew he was accurate. He went out there, 3 or 4 times, and then presented what he was going to do. And then they approved it, and he went and did that. I really like those particularly. The dramatic dinosaurs. Plus he was a good mural painter. And again, he was the greatest artist in the world, of course, coming from a daughter. But he, on top of being a great artist, he was really a very nice guy with a great sense of humor.
George Vander Sluis painted the Riverton post office mural. He was one of many young artists who attended the Broadmoor Art Academy in Colorado Springs.
He came from the Colorado Fine Arts Center. I do know that he came up here into Fremont County, and particularly in Riverton. He was looking for inspiration as to what to paint for a mural for the Riverton post office.
In Colorado, there were a number of schools where fine art was being taught, and one of the longest traditions was the Broadmoor Art Academy, which became the Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center. There are a number of artists that were associated with that school, and some were only there for one summer, some for many summers, either as students and then faculty, or in a lot of cases both. And so I knew that Vander Sluis was one of the people that was there going in the fall of '39. And so I've always had an interest. And then at one point was contacted by one of the sons saying they had a great big pile of their dad's material and they were interested in doing something with it, and would I be interested in helping them with that.
He spent several days in the area checking out the variety of activities, the sugar beet farming, the lambing, the cattle raising, and he ended up settling on the lambing scene, which he witnessed at the Pitts Madden Ranch. That's located north of Riverton on Highway 26, roughly about 4 or 5 miles, heading towards Shoshone.
We went to school in Cleveland, at the Cleveland Institute of Art, and then came out to the Fine Arts Center, and was actually married when he was out here. And I think divorced before he left, but I'm not quite sure what the history is there. But he, after he left Colorado and went to New York, he taught at Syracuse from the fall of '47 until 1980. And his style progressed over time, became more modern, more abstract, and then he followed things that interested him, you know, beyond what he saw, say, in the Colorado landscape.
It's now known as Cottonwood Courts, but at that time it was a lambing and shearing location for William Madden, who owned the area in 1906. And from there on, that's where George Vander Sluis came about his inspiration for the lambing scene that is painted at the Riverton post office.
There was material from the time he was in Colorado which certainly would fall into the category of kind of a modernist take on regionalism. And when he went back to New York, he just became, I think, more modern, and then moved into some pure abstraction, and then he had things related to space. In the 70s, actually a little bit before that, in the, think about the mid to late 60s, he actually went around and painted barns, or the sides of barns, or barn doors in New York State, upstate New York, with geometric designs. So, and then he taught at the same time, so, you know, art really was his life.
Verona Burkhard made the mural in Powell and later became a prominent member of the Western Colorado art community.
I've been here 15 years and always had seen the mural when I've come in. We've talked about it with other historic entities, and just always thought, I need to do some more research, and just kind of something that got put on the back burner until recently when I was given the book on the New Deal things in Wyoming, the New Deal art, and this gentleman who I mentioned, Henry Yapel, who had gone to Deer Lodge, where Verona has another mural at the post office there. And through a series of him doing some research, he came to me and piqued my interest again.
The way in which I got to know Verona Burkhard was through my family. My father was Frank Macho, who, in his career as an artist, he was a Coloradan who was the head of the Department of Drawing and Sculpture and Painting at Columbia University in the early 1940s. And it was there that he met Verona Burkhard, who was already an accomplished artist, but who nevertheless studied further at that time at Columbia University, and that was under my father, Frank Macho. And so they became close friends, and then as a result, she became someone who is a friend of all of the family. I'm one of 4 children, and my mother was very close to Verona also. Verona, although she was from the East, from first of all New York City and then New Jersey, and sometimes spent time in Massachusetts, she moved to Grand Junction in about 1947.
There was a fashion designer in her family. Her grandfather was a sculptor. He has a sculpture in the Washington Park in New York City. She went to Cooper Union. It looks like, I remember saying something about going to teaching at Columbia University. A lot of art, a natural progression for her. And she has a mural in North Carolina, and it recently was taken out of the post office, and the post office then became the historical center, and just last month the mural has come back to the post office, the original place it was done, but now that post office is a historical center, so it kind of has a nice little synchronicity how that came back.
As a young woman, she did take a couple of trips out west, and she really fell in love with the West. So much so that she spent some summers in Wyoming, Buffalo, Wyoming. She made great friends with some ranchers there, and actually went on trail rides and had pretty wonderful experience of being with cowboys and horses and the wonderful landscapes in Wyoming.
I can speak for the one that's in ours. You know, it's representing a farming family, and there's sheep and cows, and I can't remember, I think they're holding a baby, but there's chickens, and you know, we are such a rural community, we're a farming community, and to know that the New Deal was sort of about you know, keeping hope and keeping, you know, that we're all going to get back on the right track again after, you know, after some tough times.
When she came out west on those visits, she thought and felt strongly, clearly, just looking at her art, that the local scene of both people and landscape, horses, cattle, and so on, should be, and wildlife, should be portrayed. In her own development, she began to experiment with more abstract forms of art. And when she came to Colorado in about 1947 to move here, she was attracted to the mountains, but found that the mountains around Redstone, Colorado, where my father was, and she would have worked perhaps with him doing some projects, and they had a good friendship, so Redstone, Colorado is high up in the mountains, and she could not stand the cold winters. So she spent more time in the desert in Utah, and Grand Junction is one of the lowest spots in Colorado and has a dry climate, not much snow, so she was attracted here. But Grand Junction was hardly a center for the arts. It's a regional center that supported mining and resource development and farming and ranching, but was not unfriendly to art, but it didn't have too much, had not developed it very much. She offered classes to both young and old, and at length, with other people interested in the arts, they established this institution, the Art Center of Grand Junction. And were it not for her and a couple of those other people and certain people who were financially able to give some backing, this institution wouldn't have been established.
Manuel Bromberg painted the mural in Greybull. At age 100, he is still actively painting and sculpting from his studio in Woodstock, New York.
Forensic science movie where they do these things on murders and they have forensic clues. Well, all of a sudden I saw one, there was Greybull, Wyoming, and the streets of Greybull. And I said, oh, I've got to see this, because I didn't see anything other than this ordinary buildings and houses and so on. So I have no idea, other than the forensic science little cut of Greybull, what Greybull looks like today, or however, there are people that came to Woodstock who were in the art world who had been to Yellowstone. That's what I was trying to think of, and they stopped at Greybull. And they loved the mural, and they wrote to me about it. These are art connoisseurs, and so that's the only one. the connection I had again with Greybull was from people who had stopped to see, had gone in the post office and seen the mural. I'd been drawing cowboys and dances. I went to all the, barn dances and stuff. Cowboys were romantic, their costumes are so great and everything about it, that I knew that I wanted to do cowboys. But cowboys rounding up the herds, cowboys that maybe at dances. I mean, I thought that over in my mind. Suddenly I was looking at some old masters, and there was a kind of religious scene, well done, with a group of prophets, I guess they were, in the landscape, and then a lone figure, probably Jesus, And I, at the time, had done a painting called The Harmonica Players, which was shown in the World's Fair in New York as American art. And it was a beautiful painting of a black man on a mud road on his knees and his hands up like that, playing a harmonica. Beautiful line, And the painting was highly regarded in New York. And so I said, I've got to use this painting again somehow. So I decided I was going to have a cowboy playing a harmonica, you see. And the prophets were going to be cowboys who were singing, like a trio themselves, So you have the trio, you have the central harmonica player. Well, then, for the sake of the composition, I found I had to do this. I had to put in a cloth sweeping in this way. I had to add a figure of a backside of a guitar player. These were added later, but the original ones, they weren't in it, or that wasn't in it. And it all turned out quite right. So that's Greybull, which was immediately, there were artists, well-known artists, who wrote to the section of fine arts talking about seeing this mural, calling me a boy. There's a boy doing this mural, which is such a swell job. What a word to use, swell, But I didn't know these letters were being going. All I knew is the section of fine arts were suddenly treating me like I was a delicate, precious thing that had to be handled carefully and with high regard. So while I was in the process of doing this, I got a letter from the director of the section of fine arts of the mural things, a man named Ed Rollins, saying that Stimson, is that familiar to you?
Yes.
Well, not the Stimson you knew, but his father. Stimson was objecting to my mural. Here I was happily working on it in Colorado, and here comes this man objecting to my mural. And why was he objecting to it? No aesthetic reason. He objected that the boots were not Wyoming boots, or the hat were not Wyoming hats, and all the while I thought the best boots that cowboys could buy was in Texas. Everybody wanted a pair of Amarillo boots. I mean, no matter where you were as a cowboy, that was the most. And here this guy is complaining that I have to change the hats, I have to get the correct boots. So we put him off. We said, oh yeah, so I will do Wyoming hats. Yes, I'll make the boots. I'll take off the Amarillo boots, and that was my only big problem with it. While I was painting it, all of New York art world came to Colorado. And the reason for that was that most of the people, including Kuniyoshi, were former students of my teacher. And in respect to him, and the fact that the weather was great, and it was the place to be, the best of the art world was in Colorado Springs. So Life magazine came out because the artists who were well known in New York were all now in Colorado, and it would be a nice summer issue or something. The Life magazine, there was a well-known New York photographer, spotted this beautiful girl who was a model in New York, and he knew her as a fashion model. And she was a wonderful artist as well, better than the fashion artists who were doing her. And he said, oh, Jane, her name was Jane Dow, D-O-W. You couldn't, unless it was Jane Doe, it couldn't be simpler than that. He said, Jane, he says, if you can find a young man to go with you, we'll put you both out in the Garden of the Gods, these red rock formations, and do a cover for Life, you know, the two of you sitting on there. So she asked me if I'd like to sit with her. And of course, we later on got married. This gorgeous woman, I had no idea how talented she was until, you know, a fantastic draftsman. And Jane was in New York. So all in all, it seemed, once I got Geneva Mural up, I might as well go to New York. It was sort of fun. But I was cold, I was lonely, and Jane was in New York, and she's gorgeous, you know. And I decided, to hell with it, I'm going to get married. Planning is not my big thing. I'd been given another mural commission. The draft board wasn't the least bit interested in that, you know. And so Jane went home, went back to her mother to have the baby, and I went in the Army. And of course, at the time, my only vision of the Army was All Quiet on the Western Front. Have you ever seen that movie? Well, that, you know, with bayonets and all that. And I thought, well, this is what I'm getting into. But not at all. It seems to me, I don't know if there's an angel over me or this is all pre-written. I have no idea. But I must say it's too, it just reads too well.
Louise Emerson Ronnebeck was commissioned to paint the mural in Worland, which was later moved and now on display in Casper.
The time was very tough for everybody, and artists as much as anybody else. Portrait commissions dried up during the 30s, obviously. Louise entered 16 competitions for murals, and she won 2, and I think that's a pretty good odds there. She tried for, I mean, I could probably list, if I was reminded, I could give you a list of all the competitions, but it was Amarillo, Washington, D.C., Worland, Wyoming, and all over the West. My grandfather, Ronnebeck, moved to Paris in 1907 to study art. He studied sculpture there from between 1907 to 1913 when the war started. In 1926, wanted a break, and he heard all the great things about Taos, New Mexico, and Mabel Dodge Lujan had invited him at her home in Taos, New Mexico. And coincidentally, at the same time, Louise Emerson was also visiting Mabel Dodge Lujan in Taos. coincidentally, both of them came from New York to travel out to Taos, and two New Yorkers met in Taos in 1926. And they spent several weeks together, and horseback riding and painting and sketching, and were married. That was in 1925, and they were married in 1926, and then moved to Denver. Because of my grandfather's connection with Marsden Hartley, he knew Alfred Stieglitz quite well, and one of my grandfather's busts of Hartley was exhibited at Stieglitz's gallery in 1925 at an American Place. And Arnold Ronnebeck also wrote an essay for, the exhibit was 7 Americans. And so he knew Stieglitz and Georgia O'Keeffe quite well. In fact, in October of 1924, he spent 2 weeks at Stieglitz's Lake George home up in New York. I didn't know her very well. I grew up in Chicago, and Louise lived in Denver. But I had this idea of her. I would see her when she would pass through Chicago on her way to or from someplace. She spent a lot of time. She had lived in Bermuda for many years, so sometimes she would come every year. She would travel from Bermuda to go back to Denver, and she would stop in Chicago. So I'd see her there, and she always, to me, she was this kind of vision, this glamorous vision that came in wearing all this silver jewelry, and she would always sweep in with lovely gifts. And she painted my portrait when I was quite young. Unfortunately, my parents got rid of that portrait, so I don't have it. One of my favorite paintings of hers that I have is of a very odd scene. It's a car accident. And there's just crowds of people and cars. It was very dramatic. She liked action. She liked to paint battle scenes for Old West battle scenes and things that maybe people may not think were stereotypical of what a woman would paint. But she also did like to paint. She did a lot of portraits of local Denver society people, and she loved crowds, and she did a well-known painting for B, my father's 4th grade class, and so she liked a lot of crowds. And her other well-known painting is The Trial of Mary Elizabeth Smith from 1937, which depicted a trial that she went to every day to watch the trial. It was a woman, a young girl, who killed her abusive husband. And Louise went to the trial every day and made a lovely painting of it.
What's the legacy of New Deal art? Art forms in public spaces are as old as the hills. Northern Arapaho tribal member and artist Robert Martinez provides workshops on indigenous art for young people and has painted murals in Riverton.
I wanted to get across that there's a very rich and long historical tradition and history of natives creating art and artifacts. Everything that was used as a tool in most native cultures was adorned in some way, and then of course there was always other objects that were super adorned. So we have a long history of creating art. Well, it kind of depends on the site and the specific images that are there. Some of them were used for commemorating different things. Some of them are used as waypoints. But we do find a lot of those symbols that come into what we know as traditional life and contemporary life now, such as the wheel, those particular forms like castle gardens. We can interpret those as a wheel or shield designs and motifs. The Arapahos were known originally for doing mostly geometric designs, and we were also known to use different geometric designs for different things. For example, a simple square could mean a person, or could mean a trail or a track or a camp or a place, depending on the person that was doing the design. A triangle could mean a lodge or a tent or a mountain, depending on who did the actual design. So we had certain shapes that are common, but they could mean very different things depending on the artist.
Michael Cooper in Nashville, Tennessee was commissioned to make a mural in Cheyenne, Wyoming for Ed and Karen Murray.
That was considered a call out of the blue. Ed happened to have been here in Nashville, was over at Vanderbilt with one of his daughters, and happened to be driving past one of my murals and liked it. He said, "Well, that's pretty cool." And he looked down in the bottom right-hand corner, and there was my name and phone number. And he had an idea of something he wanted to do back in Cheyenne, and he literally just called me and said, "Would you be interested in painting a wall in Cheyenne?" It's like, sure. And we met the next day for breakfast. Mickey and I went over there, sat down and talked with him. And the more we talked, the more he said, "Yep, you're the guy." And that was it. We were on our way to Cheyenne.
We wanted this to be a fun, collaborative type process. And so there was discussion as to the subject matter. And of course, there's Wyoming wildlife discussed. There was Wyoming themes, real cowboy, Cheyenne Frontier Days, Wyoming's a cowboy state and so forth, and that type of discussion as subject matter. And so people were very surprised at first when my wife and I decided to go with a Renaissance cherub.
It's one of those things where as many times that I tried to come up with something specific for that wall, we went through a long design process, and it still came down. Ed had in his mind what he wanted and what he envisioned. So it didn't matter what I came up with different ideas, it still came back to, he had a pretty good idea. So we took his idea, fine-tuned it, put it on paper, and it turned out, yep, that's perfect. That's what he envisioned.
My father, Ned Murray, he was a voracious collector of numerous different things, everything from wagons to fine art, but he also collected cherubs. And so I grew up as a kid surrounded by cherubs, and he let me know that these cherubs, many of which were antique cherubs, came from Western settings, including saloons and hotels that had been part of the Old West, because cherubs would denote and exude a civility and a peace.
And so ended up putting that on the wall. It was a fun project. It was, how will you say, it was intense. There's a lot of work involved. If I'm not mistaken, I probably did 90% of that one by myself. Had some local help on a few things. Actually got my son out there to help on the stripping of the wall. We had to strip the entire 40-foot by 60-foot wall. And used a special paint that'll be there forever. I'm assuming it still looks good up there.
It's still there. Still
Very good. I like that. That's good. Makes me feel better.
New Deal was criticized and praised, but was an important chapter in American history.
Art back in the day was considered, well, only if you had European training, and it was in an art museum. People in the 30s and 40s didn't have art in their homes. That was just, well, they couldn't afford it, number one, but it wasn't considered any art if you put it in your home. Art was only in an art museum. Had to be European trained. The subject matter had to be European influence. And the New Deal brought in a whole different perspective on that, to say, let's celebrate the American artist, let's celebrate the American worker, the American Native Americans whose art really inspired many other forms of art. So I really revere the New Deal as something that was purely American and grassroots.
Well, what I did is another way of doing a landscape. I mean, the show I had was liked by everybody, because who doesn't like nature? And all I did was say, take a look, you know, look at this. Isn't this beautiful? I mean, there's a profundity to this thing, and there's a possible extension of going from there into something. So I'm happy with it. I'm very happy with it. But I didn't get there by accident.
Going fast forward to the Second World War, some of the artists like George Vander Sluis, for example, were part of programs that were actually designed to use art to further our efforts in the war. And the whole idea of the Ghost Army was that we created big images on canvas that made it look like our troops, our tanks were heading one direction, and hopefully we were heading the other direction. And they were wasting their bombs on canvas instead of on our people and our equipment.
And Verona, who led as I say, a solitary life, though she had many friends, she really lived a life that was, if it was under a kind of guiding star, that overcame, you know, that sense of what was important, really made her overcome many difficulties, and she didn't lose her way.
She was a modern woman at a time when that wasn't as common, and she did have a fairly good work-life balance, balancing the children and a husband and a household, but she was always dedicated to her art, and I think it showed. And she worked hard and studied hard, and I think left us a nice legacy.
I got there by having a breakdown. I got there by going through the war, having a great success in my pre-war times, and realizing in France, being with great French artists, Picasso and Cocteau and so on, there was far more to art than what I was into, what I was doing.
New Deal era people and programs help shape current attitudes about the evolving social culture and physical landscapes of Wyoming and America. The artwork created during the New Deal added to the beautification of cities and towns in Wyoming. Many Wyoming communities take part in creative placemaking, creating environments where people want to live, work, and play, and improve the livability of a place they want to call home.
There's a lot of wall art that's come up around town, and different people coming in doing different things. people donating spaces and say, yeah, we'd love for you to do something. People coming from all over the world, different artists coming here just to put some artwork up. So again, it shows a lot of diversity, a lot of different styles.
Public art can raise awareness and provide safe spaces where communities can come together to discuss tough issues around topics like diversity, the environment, and sustainability.
An interesting example of what we see in downtown Wyoming. That is public works of art, except down here they're working on murals on the side of buildings. And it's really pretty interesting. You have to drive down through there and look at them.
Just within the last couple of years, it has exploded. So it's free, doesn't cost you a thing. You can be entertained for days just by walking around town.
Anytime you can go out and see art, I encourage you to do so, whether it's in public or in a gallery or in an artist studio. Get out and see it. And if you can't get out, look at it online.